We all build what's called cellular memory, different from genes and chromosomes, what we inherit. And we are a compilation of the cellular memory probably back 3 or 4 generations in our biological line. When you get a heart transplant, you get an organ from somebody who has built different cellular memory. So people often change, at least temporarily, after they've had a major organ transplant. So I said to him, be ready, he may come sit down at the organ and start playing jazz. I don't know what the heart he has used to do for music. And then of course we start building our own, but it's really an interesting concept. Pastor Todd told me I was supposed to stay in the light. Well, I want to live in the light. I don't know if I'm going to manage to stay in the light the whole time this morning, but I'll give it a whirl. So the topic is the brain and spirituality this morning. You know, historically, spirituality was talked about perhaps more and emphasized more than it is in mainstream churches today. Of course, it's very biblical. Some people think that the reason it changed was because they got nervous about spiritualism, and they kind of misidentified spiritualism as one thing and spirituality as something else. So in Galatians, we're told about the fruits of the Spirit and whatever else human beings are. Most researchers now pretty much agree that we are at least 3 dimensions: relational, sexual, whether or not you're exhibiting any behaviors, and spiritual. But we've kind of lost track of the spiritual part. And for many, many, many people, spirituality and religiosity, affiliation with a religion, have been synonymous, and they are different concepts. The Institute of Heart Math, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they're doing fabulous research on the neurons in the heart and how we think with our hearts. There is a scripture about that. I'm sure you remember that. And when I was young and a preacher's kid, I asked my Bible teacher one time, what does it mean you think with your heart? And of course back then we didn't know, and that we didn't know the heart had neurons. We thought it was all muscle. And the Bible teacher said, well, you know, back then they didn't know much about the brain and physiology and all that stuff, so just substitute mind in that verse. As you think with your mind, so are you. And now we know that they may have been, quotes, uneducated, but they were right. We think with our hearts. But because it's a subconscious organ, you have to get the information up to your brain to know what your heart is thinking. And your heart is probably the basis for spirituality. So this is what Dr. Childers said, and I really loved that you read out loud together for a little bit. So I'm going to have you read out loud with me once in a while, because one of the anti-aging strategies is reading aloud for 10 minutes a day. How many of you do that? How many of you are starting today? I mean, you don't have to have a prescription for that. Costs you nothing. Reading aloud. I was in Australia and I was mentioning this, and a lady said to me, I live alone. And it went right over my head, and I just kept talking. And she said, Dr. Taylor, I live alone. And I said, and what is it that you want me to know about the fact that you live alone? Well, she said, you told me to read out loud 10 minutes a day, and I'm telling you I live alone. I said, I don't remember saying you had to read to anyone but yourself. Oh, she said, I couldn't sit in the house all by myself and read out loud. I'd be embarrassed. I said, I thought you said you lived alone. Oh, she said, I just couldn't do it. I said, do you have any pets? Oh, yeah, she said, I have this beautiful Himalayan Persian, whatever that looks like. I said, fine, you take the cat, you plop it in a chair, you read out loud 10 minutes to the cat. What do you suppose she said? Well, I don't think the cat would understand what I was reading. Read out loud 10 minutes a day to the cat, to yourself, to the air. All right, read this with me. Sustained positive emotion and feeling states are not as pervasive in most people's lives today. They are transient experiences occurring randomly and dependent primarily on external events rather than internal events. Moments of heightened spiritual connectedness are rare rather than being intentionally chosen and generated, and that is desperately sad because we are spiritual beings. It comes from inside out. Most research in the past lumped together affiliation with religion and spirituality. In fact, still in large sample studies, people will often say, "Oh, I'm very spiritual," because they attend church. And now we know that those are two separate concepts. They do not necessarily align. And if I were Pastor Todd and his staff, I would be desperately hoping the people attending this church were also spiritual. And that's a personal journey. Because it's been so difficult to look at research and pick out how does spirituality contribute versus how does affiliation with religion contribute, researchers are now trying to craft research projects that can factor for that. So there have been about 9 recent studies, and I'm going to go through information quite quickly this morning. I will be putting these on my website so you can look them up again if you want to, and give you some idea of how they differ and how spiritual activities, which are often done in church, personal prayer is a clearly spiritual activity. We also have corporate prayer. Music, personally, is a spiritual activity, depending on the type of music you choose. But again, we do corporate music, so there's some of it overlaps, but it's definitely a personal journey. So here's the research definitions that the researchers are using now, trying to decide, to tease out which is contributing what to brain function. So religion involves groupings of individuals who usually have a defined set of doctrines or beliefs, along with regular worship practices. Church attendance has been decreasing in the United States as well as some other countries. And even among churches that still have congregations, 2/3 of the attendees are female. So things are changing in our culture, and I don't know exactly what we're going to do about that. So read with me the definition of spirituality. Do you know the reason that it's powerful to read aloud? Well, PET scan studies show that when you read aloud, 80% of your cerebral tissue lights up, number one. And number two, when you see it and read it and hear yourself say it, it has a tendency to go directly into long-term memory. So read the spirituality definition with me. The practice by the individual of love-based attitudes that are integrated into an individual's everyday life and that can be shared with others, but do not require organized grouping for their practice. So here's my working definition. So read that with me. Spirituality encompasses the spirit in which you live life, including ethical and moral choices, a sense of something greater than yourself, such as a higher power or God, as most religions, at least in the United States, use that term. The recognition of a meaning to existence that transcends immediate circumstances. A sense of awe, affiliation, vision, or goals to achieve the highest possible levels of brain, body health, and longevity. You can be affiliated with religion and not be spiritual. And as a preacher's kid, I was probably a little judgmental growing up. My father had come home, drained after 5 hours of board meeting because people were at each other's throat about the color of the carpet. I don't think that has anything to do with spirituality. Or people would be in his office complaining bitterly about the head elder and what a poor excuse for a head elder this person was. And I don't think that has anything to do with spirituality. So they are not necessarily aligned. And many of the worldwide conflicts we're seeing today related to terrorism probably involves affiliation with a set of beliefs, but not much spirituality. A couple surveys, Gallup poll assessing religion in the United States. They say that it's a lifelong process, and that we actually can become much more spiritual as we get older. 93% of them in the survey identified themselves as spiritual, but often they said, I'm spiritual, but I'm not too big on religion. There was a real dichotomy between those two. The Moberg survey, most people in his survey considered themselves to be both religious and spiritual. But again, you see the difficulty in separating them because they primarily considered themselves spiritual because they prayed and they went to church. And so you can pray in really good ways and you can pray in kind of ugly ways. And you can attend church and be very spiritual and attend church and not be very spiritual. Because some people perceive attending church as I've accomplished a goal. Okay, I went to church this weekend. I'm a good person. Okay, I'll worry about that when next weekend comes. And they're not living a spirit-filled life all week. Newberg and Waldman, you may have read their book, Why We Believe What We Believe. There's some wonderful neurotheological researchers out there now that are trying to look at the connection between what goes on in the brain and spiritual activities. They believe that the human mind may be naturally calibrated to embrace spiritual perceptions, and out of their work and others have come the belief that whatever else we are innately spiritual. There isn't just one part of the brain that is activated during spiritual practices, just like there is not just one part of the brain activated when we pray. Depending on the type of prayer and so on, different parts of the brain can be activated. But being very spiritual hits the whole brain in some way or other. I'm sure you know that our brains are composed of two hemispheres, about the size of your fists. And I always get tickled with that. The other day I was talking to a group of freshmen whose brains are not done yet. So we have to cut them a little slack. That largest bridge, the corpus callosum, it is not even finished being paved. It's called myelinated until 2021. And many people have made life-impactful choices and decisions before their highway was even paved. And then the prefrontal cortex and the parts of the brain that clearly distinguish us from other mammals. Yes, human beings are mammals. But the part that clearly distinguishes us, some of which pieces are in this prefrontal cortex right behind your forehead, that's not done till mid to late 20s. So that's one reason it's a lifelong process. But I was telling them that your brain is about as big as your two fists. And there was one young man in the group who was pretty much of a hunk. I tell my grandchildren I'm not so over the hill that I don't recognize a hunk when I see it. So he puts his hand up and he goes, Dr. Taylor, I'm really, really smart. And I said, well, you may be. What makes you think that? Well, look at my hands. I have huge hands. I hated to burst his bubble, but size really doesn't have much, if anything, to do with smarts, unless you're acephalic and really have no brain tissue. I mean, Einstein, very small brain, relatively speaking, but huge numbers of glial cells, the cells, the personal assistants for the thinking cells, the neurons, the connections on each neuron that allow them to connect with other cells, packed with those. So it's not size. 2 hemispheres. The left hemisphere, the type of functions it houses would be the kind that would allow somebody to affiliate with a religious organization, to understand the rules and the rites and the rituals and the dogma and so on and so forth. The right hemisphere is the part of the brain that allows us to really hone our spirituality, to connect, to strive for harmony rather than foolish argument and meaningless controversy. The desire to connect with a being outside of yourself. You know, whether you're in a far corner of the world that they never even heard the term God, still many of those people, according to the spirit of prophecy, had a sense about something out there is larger than me. What's interesting in John is that when people worship, the true worshipers, they worship in spirit, which means they pull in the right hemisphere, and they also worship in truth, which pulls in the left hemisphere, as in the dogma and the theology, which hopefully is accurate. I mentioned the corpus callosum, which is the largest of several bridges that connect the 2 hemispheres, because if you don't have connections, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. And for those people who have developed horrible seizure activity, it can start in one hemisphere, and if it flows across that corpus callosum and involves the other hemisphere, then likely the person will die, because the electrical impulses will be too chaotic flying all over the brain. So in order to save the lives of some of those individuals, researchers went in and cut the corpus callosum, and therefore they would then get a seizure on one side or the other, but it wouldn't cross the bridge and involve the entire brain. And what researchers learned from that was that when that major bridge is cut, literally the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. So you would say to that person, take your right hand and put it on your left shoulder. Okay, that's instantaneous for most of us. You know, take your right hand, put it on your left knee, done deal. You ask those individuals, put your right hand on your left shoulder, and they start moving in that direction. They come to the midline of the body, and they never can cross the midline. So they can never do those crossover exercises. So there's another bridge that connects the left temporal lobe, right here, which is all about doing a ritual, with the right temporal lobe, where you often can trigger a spiritual response. That was interesting for me to learn. I remember as a girl, it would be 13th Sabbath, and they would be doing the foot washing and the Lord's Supper and all of that. And I could name the members in my dad's church. There were probably about 400 of them back then. I could name the ones that would sit in the pew and would not participate. They didn't leave, but you'd ask them, you know, come and participate. No, I'm just going to watch. Okay, fine, glad they're there. But now we know this. When you participate, it triggers that bridge, and you will, in your right hemisphere, get a spiritual response that you won't get if you don't participate. So I wish we'd known that back then, because I might have not been so timid that I would go and explain that to people, that you're going to get a whole different spiritual response if you participate. So I really enjoyed hearing the congregation reading together. That's participative. And if you don't do it, you probably won't get the same spiritual response, because reading occurs in the left temporal lobe, regardless of handedness, pretty much. There'll always be an exception somewhere. But you'll get a different spiritual response. Personal prayer. There's many types of prayers. When I do a seminar on prayer, I got a whole slide of just different kinds of prayer. Intercessory and petitionary and on and on and on. Well, personal meditative prayer provides the greatest personal benefits, and it's all wrapped up with your sense of spirituality. A few minutes of occasional prayer may not change the brain in any large degree, but if you do consistent prayer every day over time, PET scan studies show you can change your brain. When prayers are sung, a different response will occur in the brain. It's highly stimulating to all four of these chunks. And of course, if occasionally you write out your prayer and then read it, that's also going to be very, very good for your brain. Too bad I don't have a video of a PET scan to show you. I'll give you briefly the research. If you think of my face as a clock, think of your face as a clock. 12, 6, 9, and 3 on the sides. Draw two lines between 12 and 6 and 9 and 3, whichever is on whichever side. That's really the cerebral cortex. So researchers were doing a PET scan, positron emission tomography, and they asked individuals to read silently to themselves a paragraph. And then they watched what was happening in the brain. It's just marvelous to be able to watch what the brain is doing while a person's still alive. How revolutionary. Up until then, what you knew about the brain, you could put in a thimble. You could watch behaviors and try to figure where in the brain that was coming from. Or, after the person kicked the bucket, you cracked their skull, took out the brain, sliced it literally on a meat slicer, laid it out on a light table, and saw what you could figure out about that brain. And we learned a lot about anatomy and so on, but it didn't do a thing for the person whose brain was on the light table. Now you can actually see the brain functioning and where in the brain the cells are working that let you do that activity. It's just so exciting. So they were asking an individual to read something silently, and a little pinpoint of light showed up in each of those 4 chunks, showing that it really takes a little bit of the whole brain to read silently. Not part of the experiment, but one of the researchers said, wonder if anything different would happen if we asked them to read it out loud. I said, well, try. So they said, read this again, but this time read it out loud. 80% of the tissue lit up, because it's such a stimulating, complex activity to read aloud. So much so, it is now one of the anti-aging strategies, and you don't need to do it a lot. I told this to a church some time ago, came back the next year. How many of you were here when I was here last year? Okay, 3/4 of them put their hand up. Did you remember me telling you that reading aloud is an anti-aging strategy? Yes. How many of you are doing that every day? 5 hands went up. Paul said, it's not that I don't know what to do. It's that I don't do what I know. So, you need to do what you know. Aging. People who are high in spirituality often are healthier and live longer. There seems to be a connection. The The most important factor in healthy aging is one's personal perspective of life satisfaction. Belief that your life has meaning, that you have goals, and that's all about the spirit in which you live life. Prayer, of course, is a form of meditation. Some people get terrified when I even use the word meditation, but there are many types of meditations, just like there's many types of vehicles. And there are some that are really, really beneficial to the brain. They engage the two frontal lobes. And when these two frontal lobes are engaged, look what happens. They protect against age-related deterioration. That means actual shrinkage of brain tissue associated with loss of memory, overall loss of mental function, and dementia. Okay, here you go. 12 minutes a day. Research shows that prayer for 12 minutes a day consistently, personal meditative praise, gratitude prayers, may slow age-related decline of the frontal lobes. I need to do that regularly, and I do. I get way more than 12 minutes. Great time to pray is sitting at a red light or stuck in traffic. I mean, come on. My goal is to live to be at least 122 years, 164 days. And thank you for laughing, pastors. It's possible. Jean-Louise Calment, who lived in France, died in 1997. That's how old she was, and we hardly had the anti-aging strategies even known back then. I figure if she can do it, I can do it. At least that's what I'm aiming for. And I need to protect my brain from age-related deficits insofar as possible, and prayer is one of those ways. Abundant evidence that mental health is connected with spirituality and also with health. Wonderful research about women with advanced breast cancer, not wonderful that they had it, but wonderful research about what prayer and meditation did for them. Most of them eventually died because they only put people in the study who had really, really advanced breast cancer. But what they found is as their spirituality went up, their fear of death decreased. Some of them lived half again as long as individuals who were not engaged with their spirituality. So that's really worth looking at in terms of connection with health. In his book, Thanks, the author is really clear that religion can exist as a cerebral exercise. You can align with the tenets of a religion and do it just from your head and not pull in your heart. But it appears that spirituality requires the heart. McGill University has found a minimum of 40,000 neurons in every heart they've studied. And your heart's less than half the size of your brain, and we used to think it was just muscle tissue. It's filled with thinking cells. So as I mentioned, we not only think with our brains, but we think with our hearts. And our hearts are required for really high levels of spirituality. The interesting thing that we're finding about the heart is because it's got all these neurons, that it's almost like an independent mini brain. And researchers show that the heart has an extensive intrinsic nervous system. It's built into the heart. And it's capable of making functional decisions independent of the brain, which is fascinating to me. So research suggests that your most effective decisions are made in combination with heart and brain. But the heart can make its own decisions. So for example, somebody gets a notice that somebody they love very much has died, and the heart just goes into contractions because of the sadness of this, and occasionally they can have a heart attack and die. And the heart independently felt so bad that the person died along with the person that they heard about who had just died. This is fascinating to me. There's a bit of difference in the way males and females approach things, and if that's news to you, get with the program. So women have 4 modes of perception: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, and they can move easily among and around those if they're not in a lot of physical distress because of the physical demands that are being put on their body. Males tend to perceive things in only 2 forms: physically or intellectually. But what the male brain can do that the female brain doesn't seem to do easily is that males can backtrack to identify an intellectual reason for their emotions. They can back up in a sense and say, you know, I'm experiencing the emotion of anger because of blah, 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 blah. And they can outline the steps. Okay, there's no printout capability in the female brain, none whatsoever. So you guys just stop asking women why, because it's not going to happen. They don't back up and go through those steps. It's a very global brain compared to your more lateralized brain. And if you push them to give them an answer, to give you an answer, there's no way for them to give you an answer because the brain doesn't do that. But if they feel like to save their lives they have to give an answer, they'll give you one and it'll be a lie. I think it's because of this. Well, no kidding. Probably has nothing to do with it, but you pushed them. So just know, doesn't happen. So females can translate spiritual information into a physical or an intellectual mode, but they can also sense it and feel it and try to articulate it in a direct feeling state involving emotions and feelings and in the spirituality sense. And they're really okay with that. And another woman will get it. Well, males tend to translate spiritual information into either a physical mode or an intellectual mode. And they get nervous when women start talking from a spiritual or an emotion-based perception. And I used to see this in Sabbath school classes. Man would be, doing his Sabbath school thing and probably a great presentation from a physical or an intellectual or combination mode. And a lady in the class would put her hand up and she'd go, this week I was reading such and such and I started to feel or sense and you can see his eyes glaze over. Has no idea what she's saying. None whatsoever. And he's polite and lets her speak. And she finishes and he goes, thank you, and goes right on with what he was saying before because he has no idea what she just said. The women in the group do, but he doesn't. So I'm not advocating that you have to have separate classes for males and females, but I am telling you that males don't get the way women perceive spirituality. And so you might want to sit down and talk to your wife or your sister or somebody and say, when you say I have this sense of, can you find words to tell me what that means? Because I don't get it. Approach to spirituality, here's those 4 chunks again. I've labeled them so people can have some sense of what they bring to the table. This is the prioritizing frontal left lobe, the envisioning frontal right lobe, the maintaining posterior lobes, those occipital, parietal, temporal on the left side, and the same thing on the right side. So people are going to approach spirituality differently based on where their energy advantage in their brain is, because researchers believe that we're born with an energy advantage in one of these 4 over the other 3. You can use your whole brain, but one of those you use with such a small amount of energy that it feels like you're hardly even working. And I think there are 4 gospels because there are 4 cerebral divisions. It's my brain's opinion. And because the kernel of salvation can be found in any of the gospels, one of those might appeal to your brain more than another, because the writer may have been aligned with the functions in that particular quadrant. So Luke investigated, and here's my conclusions. Matthew, the detail, entire sermons in detail. John, connection. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with, very connecting. And then Mark, and I always liked Mark best. My dad didn't. He liked John best. I liked Mark best. And I didn't realize the reason, but I think it's because that's where my energy advantage is. And Mark emphasized the unusual. And I want the unusual. I want to know not just the basic stuff. I want to know the unusual stuff on top of it. So you might read the 4 Gospels with the purpose of saying which one resonates most with my heart. And you may have a favorite. Okay, so here's the bottom line. We are spiritual creatures. It looks like that's innate. You still have to hone it. We have innate ability to speak, and you still have to learn language. So, the quality of your spirituality impacts every aspect of your life, whether or not you think it does. I really like the Colossians. Read this with me. Ask to be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all spiritual wisdom. Until I started studying this, I kind of missed that text in Colossians, but that is just an amazing text. So, bottom line, your brain has the capability of developing a high level of personal spirituality. It will be the spirit in which you live life. It's your job to hone it in the brain that has been leased to you for use on this planet. May the Lord bless you as you do that. Thank you.